There are a number of different ways to blend in Photoshop. One of the most frequently asked questions by beginning users is, how do I go about blending the things that I'm doing? And so I want to show you a couple of them. They're not very hard. In CS5 there are some brushes that I will show a little bit later that work really well when blending, but there are also a few tricks that you can use in earlier versions that I want to show you real quick. I've painted up the face here on this girl enough that you can see there's some areas that need blending, things that I've left off a little bit. So I want to show you one of the methods that I use to go ahead and make very smooth blends when I need them. They are, they're extremely smooth. They will blend one color into another very easily, and for something like skin, it really is an ideal method to blend. Of course, one of the ways that you can blend also, hit that accidentally, is simply by building up transparent layers of paint. And in Photoshop, it's simply a matter of just overlapping, as you can see I'm doing here. And eventually, you can create smooth transitions from one color to another. It works a little bit better if I use a brush that's rougher. So I'll pick one of these brushes that I've got, one of these tools that I've got. So this Dent Stipple is kind of a nice brush. I'll go ahead and close the tool presets here, and you can see now kind of how the brush itself works. And let me undo those. And what you just basically do is, with a very low opacity, this button clicks so that the Wacom tool that I'm using fills in. And I'm going to go ahead and darken this up a little bit. But with that button clicked, the pressure that I'm painting with is determined by the stylus that I'm using. So anyway, to start this way, it's simply a matter of going with really low opacity brushes. You can see it's so low that you can hardly see it, and simply building up different, very fine, different colored layers. This is really quite an effective way to paint, and you'll find that a lot of artists use this method. You can go light to dark, whatever you want to do. The transitions are easy to build up. You can use virtually any brush to do this. I find that ones that are a little more random, that have a little bit of variation in them. So for example, there's not a lot of variation in this one. I'm going to change it just a little bit so that you can see. I'll switch the scattering here, and well, let me go here. I'll just go to Shape Dynamics, and I'm going ahead and switch the angle jitter here so that I get a little bit rougher edge. I may want to add a little noise. Go ahead and close this. And now if I paint out here so you can see what's actually happening, and let me move this up. So you see there's a rougher edge to it now. You might even want to go ahead and increase the spacing so that it's really quite open. Close this. And so now you can see I've got a kind of stroke that's really open, and visually it blends itself quite well already. So I'll get rid of these extra strokes here. Again, I usually suggest that you use the opacity at a lower level. Down in the 30s is usually where I like it the most. And then you can start painting away. And now I'm just painting with the darker colors into the lighter. I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can kind of see a little more what's happening. In fact, I'll increase the opacity so it's really quite obvious. Again, the opacity is being driven by the pressure I'm using on the stylus because I have this button checked. You can also reduce the flow, but you can see how you can kind of build through these transparent, semi-transparent strokes. A blend that, while not strictly in the sense of blended, it looks very much blended in the image itself. That's one way, probably one of the easiest ways in earlier versions of Photoshop to go ahead and blend colors. I want to show you one now that I use again for very, very smooth blends. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, and I need to create a new file first. So new, I'm going to make this 200 by 200 pixels, though really the size doesn't make any difference at all. I want a white background. I'm going to click OK. So there's my little white image. I'm going to come up under here and I'm going to define a pattern, and I'll call it blank. You can call it white. You can call it really anything that you want to call it. Blank works for me, and I'm going to close this. I'm going to come under here and I'm going to use the healing brush tool. I'm going to adjust it a little bit. It's come up and it's probably something like default. It's probably the hardness is way up. Spacing's probably way down. Size maybe. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and squeeze it a little bit and put it at an angle. This is not a necessary thing. It's just something that works well with what I like to do. I'm going to move the hardness down to about 50%, and I'm going to move the spacing up to about 94%. And I'm going to go ahead and use this. Now, right now, you need to see here too. It could be from sampled or from pattern. I want the pattern, and I want to go ahead and pick. I've got two of them here. Pick a blank pattern, and that's what you want to use. And what happens is this: you come into your image, and you can see I'm painting with this kind of white stroke. You think, man, what a disaster this is going to be. But if you'll notice, as I paint, it very, very smoothly blends the adjoining colors together. Now, I like a little bit of space between the individual portions of the brush myself, because I think it adds a little bit of an organic feel that may not be there if it was if there was no space between the dabs. So I like to use it this way. And you can see I use it generally with a bunch of short little strokes, and I will go for the most part across the edge that I want to blend. Now in the skin here it doesn't matter because I'm kind of blending the skin color back in. You can see it blends really quite nicely, and it'll blend so smoothly, in fact, that I'm going to have to clean up some of these areas again. But I go across the form, and that's why I kind of like this oblong brush a little bit, because I can run it along the form too to kind of smooth that out a little more. But I make my initial strokes across the edge that I want blended. There's really no reason you need to do that if you don't want to. It's simply a throwback to kind of my traditional painting days when I would blend colors. I would work across the edge. Now you can work it as small or as wide as you like. Of course, the wider you make your strokes, the greater the blend will be. I use this a lot when I'm painting skin or any area that I want really, really smooth. You can come in and just work all the little areas as carefully as you would like. Like the cheek, a little softer along this edge. In conjunction with coming back in and reestablishing some of these edges, I will often rotate the canvas so I can work that brush angle at the right way across the canvas, or the right way across the edge that I want to blend. So I'll rotate it back. Now I want to make it smaller, so I'll hold down the Alt key and I'll make it really small. And I'm going to zoom in here. And so on this edge that I want to be not quite as blended, I can use a smaller brush and still work across the edge and get some nice blending going. Same thing here with maybe the eyebrow as it's coming in. Rotate this back. I can use this in the eye here to smooth out these greens, smooth out the white. It's a real great way to get a really smooth, even blend between colors. Now there's another way also that you can use, especially if you want a little bit bigger kind of stroke or a little bit bigger blend. I'll go ahead and kind of tweak these across the nose. As you can see, very, very finely blending this. Very, very controlled, very, very nice. It works really quite quick. And the funny thing is, you know, I used a white pattern, a pure white pattern. Really doesn't matter what the color is. I could go in here and let's create a new one. And I'll do another 200 by 200. And I'm going to go ahead and fill it with, let's fill it with a blue. So it really is a very contrasty color to what I'm doing here. Come up and I'll define a pattern and I'll call it blue. But you can of course call it whatever you would like. Get rid of that. I don't need to save it. Come back up to my healing brush here. And again, I've got the pattern, but I'll select blue. And now I'll go ahead and blend these edges with my blue brush. It doesn't matter what the color is. It just matters that it's a solid color. So if you're working possibly on a value or area that you're having a hard time seeing what you're actually doing, you may want to change the color of the pattern you're using, or you just may like a different color pattern. Either works. I almost never use this as a final step. I will almost always come back in and rework the colors because it does tend to get a little soft in some areas, which I probably don't want. Sometimes I'll blend from the dark into the light, but it really doesn't matter. It just blends it nicely across. And again, I tend to like a little bit more spaced out dab, but you can have the dabs as close as you want and it will work fine. Blend the edge of these lips here just a little bit, the dark into the lights. So if you're going for a very, very, very soft feel, this is definitely one of the ways you can do it. Now the other method that I was talking about is pretty much the same based on this, and it works best when you've got areas of high contrast. So while I'm talking about it, I'll still be blending with this a little bit. And basically this is what you do with the pattern still selected, whatever it is. Again, it needs to be a blank pattern. You see kind of the artifacts that I get distracted here, but I kind of like these little artifacts and strokes that it leaves. So I may not try to clean all of those up. Helps me, I believe, have a little bit more painted feel. And of course, you can make it as hard or soft as you want. If I make it a little harder, the blend is a little more crisp on the edges, and if you make it softer. Now if you wonder how I'm changing the hardness and softness, it's no big secret, and it is in CS5 and I believe CS4, but I can't remember frankly. I simply, with my cursor on my tablet, I hold down the Alt key, click the top button on the pen, and I go up or down with the cursor, you can see, to harden or soften the edge, and then I go right or left to make it larger or smaller. Like that, like to be able to size things and adjust the softness on the fly. Makes for a much more immediate painting experience. Okay, now back, let me zoom out here, and back to the other blending tool I was going to show you. And I'm going to go ahead and use one of these areas of hair here, because, or even down here, because I need an area with really quite large contrast. What I'm going to use this time is the patch tool. And to do this, leave it kind of at the defaults that it shows up. And you simply draw a marquee using the patch tool around what you want to blend. Then come up here and click Use Pattern. And you can see it's blended that really smoothly all the way across. If you do it on areas where there's not nearly as much contrast, it will still work, but the effect is a little bit harder to see sometimes. So if you've got, for example, blending all this together, you don't see hardly anything there because there's not a lot of contrast for the tool to work with. You can, of course, make it a little bit narrower and use the pattern, and it still blends very, very nicely. So if you've got big areas to use and there's good contrast that you can see, you can use the patch tool also. It's more mechanical, of course. Doesn't nearly feel like painting, but it definitely will get you a very, very smooth blend as you go. So in that 15 minutes or so, I've showed you a couple of ways that you can use some of the tools, or a couple of tools, just a brush, by building up texture slowly as you go using transparent strokes. And then one of the ways I like to, which is using, I don't use the patch tool so much, but I love to use the healing brush tool, and with a pattern and simply painting your strokes. Now if you want, let me show you here, you can increase the spacing all the way, but see, that doesn't do a whole lot of good. So usually have the spacing down here where the strokes remain relatively close together. I'm going to have to come in and clean some of this up, but that's okay. You get a more organic look like this. You can see it still blends, but it's a little bit more, you got to work over it back and forth a bit more to get it blending smoothly. But depending on what you want, it's a good way to blend, works well. Good way to remove little blemishes if you've got them. And it doesn't matter, again, what color the pattern is, as long as it's a solid color. So that is the method I'm going to be using as I continue painting on the face here, because I'm going to want this complexion on this girl to be really kind of a smooth, creamy, soft blend all the way across. I will clean up some of these edges. They'll go away as I continue. And as I get farther into the painting, we'll talk about another way to blend using some of the newer brushes that are in Photoshop, and just a couple other things that you might find interesting. So, without boring you anymore listening to me ramble, there are two ways to blend in Photoshop, not necessarily Photoshop CS5. You can use those in earlier versions and get nice smooth blending in areas where you want a very controlled and smooth and soft appearance to what you're doing. I hope you find that useful, and I'm going to go ahead and continue on with this painting and see how far I can go. I want to show another way that I blend in Photoshop, and in this case I'll be blending on the red shawl on this character right here, and this is specific to Photoshop CS5. In CS5 they introduced a new set of brushes called the mixer brushes, and these are really pretty great brushes to use. If you hold down on the icon over here, it's the mixer brush tool down below, and you can see right here it brings up pretty much what it is a representation of what your brush looks like. So you can see as I move my tablet cursor, or my stylus on the tablet, the cursor changes. If you don't have a really pretty beefy machine, lots of memory, pretty fast video card, OpenGL, good OpenGL, that kind of thing, you probably want to go ahead and disable this. I'm going to leave it on so you can kind of show what my brush is doing as I blend, but you can of course close it by just going up here. When you first open the tool up here, you can clean the brush, and this is definitely not going to be a tutorial of all of the brush settings, because there are just too many. To go over, but it'll give you kind of an introduction on how I use the tool. And what you can see here is it comes with a bunch of pre-created brush settings, and basically these are useless. For the most part, I find that they just don't work very well, that really to get the best use of the brush, you will want to go in and create your own settings. For the most part also, the sliders really don't coincide with what's actually happening. Wet is the wet on the canvas. Load is the amount of paint on your brush. Mix, of course, is how much you mix of either, and flow is pretty much the same as the regular brushes, how much is coming out. This square here shows you what color you're selecting. If you don't want to load solid colors only, you can pick, when you use the eyedropper tool, it will pick, as of course now, of course it won't show what I'm doing, but it will pick, anyway, it will pick a dirty brush, so it will pick up multiple colors that you'll be painting with. Again, you can play with these, but for the most part, I really don't find that they're very useful. They were kind of done just using the settings here, setting different numbers. I find that for most of the brushes, the most useful settings are going to be at 10% or below. Once you get above 10%, you're really not going to notice very much difference in the settings, which is unfortunate because it would be nice to have them coincide with what was actually happening. Now the brushes in the brush palette, if you're going to use these brushes, let's go to the brush presets here. They are represented by these little icons that you can see here. There's a white, there are little white icons, and there are some kind of gray tipped icons. And the difference is the white brushes, and you can see here in the update as I move around, the white icons are round brushes. So you can see in the little preview image that they look, as I'm moving them around, you're not seeing anything except a round brush. And then you get down here into these with the black or gray tips, and you can see that they're a flat brush. I personally like the flat brushes better than the round brushes, but again, it's something you'll want to pick and try and choose on your own. You'll find ones you like, ones you don't like as much. A couple presets that I've got that are available for this, and they are flat ones, and I'm going to go ahead and pick one of those and then show you how I would go ahead and blend this on the girl here. So I'll go to close this and go to my tool presets, and I've got some down here, these mixer bristle brushes, and I'll just pick this top one here. And you notice how low my settings are up here. Also notice that I'm picking multiple colors. You can see in the little outlet here, but the wetness is set very low. The load is almost nothing. So what the color I'm painting with is almost nothing. Mix is 100% because I want to mix what's loaded plus what's on the canvas. And my flow is really low. I find with a low flow, I get a much better mix than I do with a high flow. So I'm going to go ahead and resize the brush down a little bit smaller, and I'm going to zoom in here. And what I do is I paint with this brush a lot like I do. Let's make sure that I've got the right layer selected. You can select multiple layers and have it work all the way through, but it just depends on the instance, I guess, whether I'll do that or not. But essentially, I paint a lot with this brush like I would with a traditional brush. And what I'm doing here is I'll go along the edges. Let's check in here for just a couple of settings, just a little bit. Spacing, everything seems fine. Just want to make sure I'm looking at everything that I wanted to show. Again, this is not meant to be really a tutorial on how these brushes work. If you're going to remember anything about them, the best thing is to remember what wet, load, mix mean, and that for the most part the sliders do not really above the numeral 10% do not make much difference in what you're doing. I find that I use these brushes a lot like I would paint with traditional paint, and that when I get to an edge, I'll rotate them around to use them on different edges, that I drag across the edge that I want to blend. Now if I want to go the opposite way, I can drag from the paint or the darker edge into the lighter paint, or vice versa. Really doesn't matter. Let me turn off this one layer here. Really doesn't matter which you do. If I'm painting like this and I want to drag and I want a larger light area, I will drag from the light into the dark. If I want to go the reverse and pull some dark up into the light, I'll do the reverse here. And you can watch. I find that pretty soon that little the little update in the corner, the little preview of what the brush is doing, becomes a little bit distracting. But again, it's really kind of up to you if you want to leave it on or not. So what I do is I make these little short strokes across the edge that I'm blending. So you can see I'm stirring it around a little bit here. And then I'll make a long, big stroke to smooth those out. This is really behaves very much like oil paint would if you were a traditional painter. And these are kind of little short tapping strokes. They're not very long strokes at all. But it helps me control the edge pretty much as I want to. If I make these big sweeping strokes across, of course, then it will blend a lot larger area. But for the most part, I work the edges. Now the same settings will work with regular brushes, so I could come up and select any of the normal brushes that you have in Photoshop. And they work kind of the same, although you don't have the benefit of the individual bristles, which I like. It takes a little while to get used to this brush, so don't, or these tools, so don't feel that, you know, don't be too frustrated with them if you're just starting to use them. They take a little while to get used to. And if you're, in particular, are used to a great deal of control, they might feel a little kind of out of control to you. Even myself, as I was painting, as you paint, it just takes a little getting used to use these brushes. If you're very oriented in very fine detail, it may take you a little longer. I wasn't really as familiar with them myself when I first started using them. Found it was a little bit uncomfortable. But now that I know how they work and how to set up the sliders, I had a lot of trouble figuring out how to get the values to work up in the sliders. Pretty soon, once I realized that they really had that they weren't working with any particular numeric value, and that over a certain amount you were seeing very little change, then it got pretty easy to figure out how to make your own brushes. So again, the brushes I'm using, they're there for you to try. Rotate the canvas a lot so I can work across the edges that I want to. And just go back and forth. Again, this is very much how I would work with traditional paint. And that's one kind of nice thing about these, is you can see they really do give kind of a gooey, organic feel. Very nice to the way real paint works. And if you increase the load, of course, then you can select a lot of color from within the image and have it work. It'll select and paint on just like a wet brush with multiple bristles loaded with different color would work. So ultimately, you kind of got to decide where and how much blending you want to go. A great tool, again, if you don't have Photoshop CS5 and you're a digital painter, this is really probably one of the main reasons that I found that it was valuable to upgrade to this specific version. Up until then, it was mostly, building up color mixes by, different opacities of individual colors, and also some people would use the smudge tool at low settings, but I never really found that very effective for my own work. And some people use it very nicely. I just don't use it very much that way. But really, with the addition of these new brushes, or these new mixer brushes, it's a nice upgrade. Makes a lot of sense. And I'll use it in conjunction with the regular brushes. I don't just stick with one brush on one specific area. I'll use this on a number of different areas, and then I'll work back and forth with some more traditional brushes. And it just, for me, nothing ever happens in one shot. It's always like it is kind of when I'm doing my traditional work, that it takes a number of tries and some patience to get the look just like I want. You can see again as I go across the edge, then I can drag along it, and I get a really nice smooth transition. Just even along the edge of the fabric here. So I zigzag back and forth through that edge, then I paint along it. Very nice, really nice effect. And just, if you experiment with them, you probably will find one brush that you like a little bit better than the others, or one variant of one of the brushes that you like a little bit better. That's kind of what happened to me here. I prefer in most of my work to use as few brushes as possible. So maybe half a dozen brushes in any individual piece. And it just simplifies down the painting process, and I'd frankly rather be spending my time painting than searching for different brushes. Now you may find, like I do with this, that sometimes it is just a little too wet for your liking. I'm going to have to clean that up because I'm smearing out some of that load into the background image. You can erase and do everything else you would do with a normal brush with these brushes. So you see I'm just kind of softening the edge there. Come back in here and go around. Again, I like the ability to drag one color into another one with such a nice, even transition. Let's go down here a little bit. Work these edges. Probably not a lot of reason to yak while I'm doing this. It's pretty self-explanatory. Give them a try though. But if you don't have Photoshop CS5, this probably, up until this release, I just didn't see a lot of reason to update, for at least brush-wise, for most of the things that I do. Although I would upgrade a lot because there were certain features. But really, for most of the painting tools, there wasn't a lot of difference between versions. And frankly, I didn't like CS4 a whole lot, but I definitely like this version. And if you don't want to buy it, at least get the demo and give it a try for a little bit just to see how well. Now what's doing is I don't have a lot of paint on there, so it's kind of picking up, or more of the load is coming through, and I'll be reworking that because I don't want it quite as light out in that area. But otherwise I really like this again. You should download the demo and give it a try. So I will go ahead and not bother you with my rambling again, because in this in this video and tutorial, I've shown you now the three main ways that I mix and blend color in Photoshop, and sometimes that is one of the more difficult things for new users to get used to. Once you get it down though, let me zoom out, show you this real quick. Once you get it down, it's not so hard. Even if you don't have CS5, using the other couple methods, the healing brush method and just layering color, you can really pretty much get just about anything you want. So let me rotate this back, reset the view, and there you have it, a little demo on how I use the healing, or not the healing brush, how I use the mixer brush tool, and there's a couple included here that you can give a try, and recommend you when you do try it.